It was some brothers in Atlanta getting major bread. Major.
Mr. Muhammad Ali has just refused to be inducted into the United States Armed Forces.
April 1967, heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali, who was in his prime, got banned from working in the U.S. or overseas as a boxer or anything else because he refused to be drafted and go fight in the Vietnam War on religious grounds.
It took an all-white jury less than a half hour to find Muhammad Ali guilty.
Finally, in the fall of 1970, Georgia State Rep. Leroy Johnson, considered possibly the most powerful black politician in all of the American South at the time, oversaw putting together Ali's comeback fight. It was against Jerry Quarry, a top contender in downtown Atlanta, which made it probably the most high-profile event in American sports that year. And the backdrop of a new Netflix series about to drop called Fight Night, starring Don Cheadle, Kevin Hart, Samuel L. Jackson, and more.
Ladies and gentlemen, here is the man responsible for bringing the fight to Atlanta, Georgia, Senator Leroy Johnson.
We were successful almost a year ago in bringing Muhammad Ali back to the ring. When some 65 cities throughout the country refused to let him fight, we brought him back and he fought here in Atlanta. And after that big fight, here on Hander Drive, a robbery took place that occurred at the time of a party. From that robbery, headlines were made all over the world about the robbery itself.
Atlanta had grew as far as people don't talk about it. Atlanta don't get its credit like Detroit or Harlem. It was some brothers in Atlanta getting major bread. Major bread. That strip club that you hear Killer Mike talking about, the people behind that, the Blue Flame, they was major hitters in the game. I'm talking about back in the 70s. The family who owned the Blue Flame go back to the 60s and 70s getting money.
Before Atlanta became one of America's fastest growing cities, it was one of America's crime capitals. In fact, when the Ali Quarry fight went down in 1970, Atlanta was outpacing Detroit as America's murder city. In its best years of black political and economic power were yet to come, Atlanta was just a small, rough, dangerous town.
These pictures were made with a special night lens in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a center for a new mob that is now competing with the American Mafia. The leaders of this organization are not from New York or Chicago. They are from small towns in North Carolina. They are black, and they have become rich by taking away from the Mafia much of the heroin business in this country.
Atlanta had become, when you talk to the OGs from Atlanta, Atlanta had become, with its proximity to Fort Bragg.
This is the way much of this new mob's heroin arrives in this country, in planes like this one, an Air Force jet carrying military cargo. The genius of the North Carolina mob has been its ability to use the American military to move its heroin from Southeast Asia to this country.
Yeah, Fort Bragg was ground zero for that China white coming in. Again, shout out to Ray Tatum from Getting Off Zero down in Atlanta. He an OG from Atlanta. He tell me story after story about everybody knew that the bag you was gonna come across up there around Fort Bragg. That's who had it. The boys at the Bragg is who had that good thing.
It hasn't gone away, and it never will. It is at the level now where it's infinitesimal, and we do not really have a problem on heroin or even cocaine within the U.S. Army establishment at Fort Bragg.
Yeah, that was common knowledge. Was coming into Atlanta heavy, as they call it, from the Bragg. Everybody knew that something was popping around Fort Bragg. Wow. It was so, that the streets knew long before the authorities knew.
But they're so carried away with all this pure dope, it ain't screwed up like the Italians give it to the black guys.
In one recent case, a civilian connected with this mob was arrested on the runway of an airbase in uniform with a set of official travel orders and a package of heroin.
And they so screwed up with it and everything, they just left the man and go on with the dope. Calling their boss and let them come down and see all this.
First person I heard the story from is a guy and his wife known as Mickey Beckworth, Frank Matthews' chief lieutenant.
Mickey Beckworth was one of Frank Matthews' right-hand men. In fact, in the indictment of 1975, It said he was the number 2 guy in the Frank Matthews organization, and he was at the Ali Quarry fight that night, along with many of Matthews' other associates from around the country, and he was planning to go to the after party at Chicken Man's house. Now, Mickey Beckworth became close friends with Courtney Brown Sr. in the late 1970s when they were both locked up at the Atlanta United States Penitentiary.
I think things have slowed down a little bit for Mickey and his regular people. So when he reached out to Pop, Pop was like, "Come to Detroit and holler at me. I'm working good right now." And Posse came to see him to shoot a move, and because Mickey was doing work up in Albany and Rochester, New York. It was recited to my old man.
And he had told Courtney Brown Jr. about the events in the big heist fight night back in the early 90s when Courtney Brown's dad was getting, as they call it, the Pakistani plug. They had a huge run in the 90s, and Mickey Beckworth actually was getting the bag from Detroit, and he had operation going on in upstate New York, Albany, and Rochester. So Courtney's been hearing about this story for years.
He also, fortunately, like the other person I heard the story from, both got sidetracked from actually attending the party. I think both got distracted by some pretty women, who in this case saved them a very bad night. All these heavy hitters is down here. They go into this after hour joint, and Mickey say it was Hustler's nightmare.
In the hours after the fight, an event as infamous as the Ali Quarry fight was famous occurred at a small house in Atlanta. It was a big stick-up of a giant illegal after-hours after party planned for the big wigs, the underworld bosses that had come down to Atlanta at the home of a guy named Gordon Chicken Man Williams, and it was at his own house.
And after that big fight, here on Hander Drive, a robbery took place that occurred at the time of a party. From that robbery, headlines were made all over the world about the robbery itself.
Just like the scene in Bill Cosby's Ode to Blaxploitation, Uptown Saturday Night, a group of shotgun-toting masked robbers hit the place. But in real life, they got to the party before it even started, bursting in on the women who were preparing the food and getting the house ready for the party. And they laid in wait and premeditated, as they say. As each guest showed up, they were made to strip from their clothes. They were relieved of any cash and jewelry and, of course, firearms. And they were put down in the basement to wait for the next people to knock on the door. And so many people came in this. It wasn't a small house. It was kind of a decent-sized house for that day. A ranch house would have been new construction in Atlanta at the time. They were getting stacked up like cords of wood. They had to lay on top of each other in their underwear. And these gangsters must not like that at all.
There was members of Frank Matthews' organization there, along with numerous heavy hitter players from all over the country. Players ball, they was all in Atlanta. These are real heavy hitters, so ain't nothing for a brother to be wearing $500,000, $250,000 worth of jewelry, watches, chains, rings. You gambling with other big fellas, so you might have $15,000, $20,000, $100,000 on you.
Could have been several million in total value. That was 1970 money. That's 8, 9, 10 times today's money. So who knows? It could have been a $15 million lick. There was only like 5 police reports filed. There were some non-criminals who went. Some successful black doctor, I think, was one, and he filed a police report.
This ain't like sticking up the local poker table. The people who pulling this off, the first thing is like, somebody has some big kahunas, because you come at this collectible people.
Estimates of how much was taken is at least $1 million, but who knows how much was taken, because these people came there to gamble. If you had 100 people that each brought 10,000, that's $1 million right there, not to mention the jewelry.
The aftermath of that, but when another OG, the OG Tyrone Stevens, who you can see on the channel, we interviewed him about a month ago, 2 months ago. He was a confidence man, but he was at a high level doing the con game and doing his pitch and drop hustle. He was running with the heavy hitters and hanging out partying with them. So when he tells the same story the way Mickey told it, that there was all the heavy hitters was there, he didn't explain that it was a string of maybe up to 8, 9 homicides that end up happening to people who from that life that were all supposedly related to as you can imagine, you can't rob 100 tier 1 hustlers.
Atlanta, which was now on the map as a major black cultural center after Ali Quarry, even though there was that robbery in 70, Frank Matthews used it in 71 to have a real summit specifically to discuss the dope business and to tell all the major dealers that they weren't going to have to deal with the Italians anymore because he was in the process of securing a large and permanent pipeline of his own, which really would have marked a true black mafia like the Italians, in the sense you could have, hey, I'm from Detroit, there's someone in Chicago or Cleveland or Akron, Ohio, or North Carolina that I can call on to help me out and settle disputes, and we all work together and we operate away from the Italians. That was Frank Matthews' dream, at least. And Frank Matthews also owned, he must have had his claws into politics down there, because he owned land that he bought that nobody was supposed to know, turned into, I think, I-75 federal highway. So Frank Matthews would have been a millionaire legally just from that land deal, but of course he got indicted and disappeared first. So Atlanta was the center of a lot of big gangster action, including that of Frank Matthews, who had a summit there and owned a lot of land there. Someone in the state government must have gave him the heads up of what was going to happen.
Frank Matthews at that time, I think, was probably under 30 years old, was extremely bright, had good leadership skills, and had convened a meeting of all of the top African American and Hispanic drug dealers in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1971. And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia and went right to the source of heroin and brought it in and controlled the distribution.
Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, similar information was coming back. Some guy named Matthews was behind the local organizations in those cities. He was in a league of his own, and he was a top, not only an organizer, but a businessman. He saw himself as that. He posed as a real estate developer, which was a front, but he bought a whole series of parcels of land where he was informed the federal highway was going to go in. Had that gone through, he would have been a multi-millionaire just on the real estate.
He always had the African Americans involved in the distribution of drugs throughout the inner cities. And in the 70s, it's when African Americans were becoming more prominent in business. The drug dealers wanted to do the same thing. And it just made business sense from their perspective to cut out the middleman, which would have been the Italian mafia, and go right to the source and import heroin and control the distribution.
Let's face it, they couldn't believe that this black guy, was working in 21 states, with this huge network, and people were coming from all over the country to buy dope from him.
At Ali's really big fight, which happened in 1971, Ali Frazier won at Madison Square Garden. Frank Lucas put himself on the public radar with wearing his chinchilla hat, but Eddie Jackson and his Detroit crew, their photo was in the same Jet magazine as Frank Lucas's. Frank Lucas had one photo. Him and his old crew had the whole top half of the page. Eddie had come out there in 10 Cadillacs. He was supposed to meet a plug. The plug he was supposed to meet kind of fell through, but he ended up bumping into some Italians while shopping at the clothing store in New York, getting ready for the fight. And they said, hey, you look like you're in the same business as us. And this Italian was a guy named Doc Lombardozzi, who was the point man for the Gambinos, who were all through the 70s still bringing in the big bag from Europe. And
Ali's prior fight to that, the Jerry Quarry fight, leads to all these hustlers getting robbed and sends shockwaves through the black underworld. then maybe none of it happens if Ali doesn't start back fighting again in 1970.
It's amazing how fast society can change at certain times and in certain ways. Think about this. In 1965, just 5 years before this fight in Atlanta, so many black people were being deprived of their basic constitutional right to vote in southern states. The federal government was forced to pass the Voting Rights Act, enforcing those rights. Interracial dating would get you arrested, if not worse, in a lot of places. Jim Crow was still in full effect. 3 years after that, 1968, the Black Panthers are having shootouts with the police all over the place. And yet, 2 years after that, 1970, Black Panthers are in decline. Black power is in decline, at least as a social movement, and a Superfly era is set to begin.
But they make us dream about owning a Rolls Royce, an Eldorado, Superfly, Shaft in Harlem, Shaft in Africa, Shaft meeting with the Jew. Today, we have the movie industry saturating the black mentality with a death wish.
Criminality replaced revolution as the cool thing, at least superficially, in, many elements of the black community. Now, was that a natural evolution? Was that an accident? Was it planned propaganda? Well, that's a serious and interesting question. We'll never really know that for sure, but it's something for you to think about.
A man like Eddie Jackson talking about no longer, I ain't trying to catch the streets, I'm trying to catch Rockefeller. That I'm so far away from yes sir and yes ma'am. I'm riding Cadillacs, I got diamond rings. I'm a black man flaunting my wealth in a very unapologetic way.
The face of the ghetto is the face of despair. It is a face whose eyes see only hopelessness.
68, 69, Nixon takes over in 68. We talked about, without getting deep into political science, maybe the Nixon administration took seeing black men empowered who are not fight the power, down with the man, wearing berets, that we need to phase out that Huey Newton look.
More black ownership of business and land and homes can be the multiplier of pride that will end our racial strife. The black man's pride is the white man's hope.
On the political side, Richard Nixon's stated policy of supporting black business, to quote Tricky Dick, the black man's pride is the white man's hope.
And these Negroes, unwittingly, driving their big Cadillacs and wearing their fur coats with all the diamonds, that's the capitalist dream that we need with black men to be seen. And that America ain't that bad for black men, and you don't need to be burning up Detroit and Newark and Watts. That y'all need to do. Now, the fact that they knew that a lot of that money was being generated from the narcotic traffic, whatever. But it's a stark difference between after Nixon takes over.
And that's why in this whole field of minority business enterprise, much of which will begin small but can eventually grow until it's big.
Only guys I ever heard prior to the Nixon taking over in 68 was right here, which you chronicled, Henry Marzat. And Pee Wee Kirkland was riding Rolls Royces, Corniches in 66. One of the chief attorneys, absolute legal legend and hero and legend in American history for those who do some deep digging, Milton Henry. In 66, Milton Henry is debating William F. Buckley and supporting his movement for the Republic of New Africa, talking about the United States government needs to give African Americans the 5 slave states of the Confederacy.
This is William F. Buckley, Jr. The guest this week on Firing Line is Mr. Milton Henry, and the subject is black separatism in America. They have designs on Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Mr. Henry is from Philadelphia, a graduate of the Yale Law School, who served 6 years in the Detroit City Council, ran for Congress, but was beaten by another Negro, Mr. John Conyers, in a race which he believes to have been stacked against him.
Now, Eddie Jackson's lawyer, Milton Henry, who Eddie Jackson paid a lot of money to when they were indicted in 71, Milton Henry had all 36 of the indictees as his clients. He took them from the local Detroit Federal Court to the Circuit Court of Appeals, all the way. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case, but they considered it for a while. So they stayed out on bond for like 6 years, and Milton Henry was making money all that time.
I don't believe there's ever been any example, historical example, of a successful biracial society. Secondly, so far as we're concerned here in America, we have, as black people, been separated out into our separate community, a community of suffering that's been almost continuous since our arrival here. I don't know of any black people who've ever escaped. You look about at the economic power. We can't think, only a fool would think that economic power in this country is shared to any degree by black people. The productivity of this country, $850 billion per year, tremendous productivity, ability to produce goods and service.
For a select few African Americans who had to achieve it by any means necessary, well, whether there was the zeitgeist, just the spirit of the times, or Nixon, certainly black capitalism, some of it illegal, started to really flourish in the Nixon administration.
Within 4 years, he's representing Eddie Jackson, Courtney Brown in federal court.
Being paid a lot of money.
And being paid more money than he ever made.
Look at the open housing situation that you're now talking about all over this country. Open housing is a myth. It's completely unrealistic and from our standpoint, of course, undesirable.
And during that time, Milton Henry went from being on William F. Buckley show talking about his organization, Republic of New Africa, wanting to live away from whites and be separate, to living in one of America's most exclusive suburbs.
But we're trying to look at it from the standpoint of your American dream. What is there about the American dream that has ever been realized by black people? What could we ever hope for within the framework of a society which is dominated by white people, in which the very factor of race enters into every consideration, into the price of an insurance premium, into the place we live, into the job we share?
So when we talk about Courtney Brown Sr.'s entry into the dope game changing his family's trajectory, it's not that they simply could buy some Cadillacs and diamonds. The money they paid their formerly black separatist lawyer Milton Henry allowed him to move into Bloomfield Hills, which was actually more elite in terms of money and power than Beverly Hills.
I mean, he was the first black person I knew to live in Bloomfield Hills.
Which was a step up even from...
Yeah, I mean...
What year did he move there?
Right after when the cake started.
It also meant that Courtney Brown Jr.'s sister attended the Cranbrook School in Bloomfield, which is around the same, a little bit after when the future almost president of the United States, Mitt Romney, whose dad was running the fourth biggest car company in America, American Motors, he went to Cranbrook. So these are the neighborhoods that Courtney Brown's children were going to school in, and that his lawyer was living in, all from street money.
Yeah, I mean, that's where all the big three leadership that wasn't in old money, Grosse Pointe, lived in Bloomfield Hills.
Leroy Johnson, the politician who got the Ali Quarry fight to happen in Atlanta in the first place, was so enterprising that not long after the robbery made national headlines, he held a press conference in front of the scene of the crime to announce that a movie about the event was in the works.
Here on Hander Drive, a robbery took place that occurred at the time of a party. And we're producing a first-class movie of the robbery that occurred here in the city of Atlanta, here where we're standing today, after the big fight between Muhammad Ali and Quarry.
Apparently, the plan to make a movie by Leroy Johnson didn't come to fruition, but it did inspire a key scene in Bill Cosby's Uptown Saturday Night.
So I heard that for the first time in 88, 89. Then I put it together that, you know what, that's crazy. And then when the timeline, I was like, that's the scene out of Uptown Saturday Night with Bill Cosby and Sidney Poitier and Madame Zenobia After Howard Joe.
Everybody get on the fucking ground! And now, over 50 years later, Netflix is finally making it all come to life, albeit in a fictionalized form called Fight Night that comes out September 2024. As for the question of whether all the robbers met their demise at the hands of the gangsters they robbed, we know a few did for sure. Up in the Bronx, New York, they were found. According to Courtney's street gossip, there was a lot more bodies that dropped, and I can believe it. But who knows? But what about the millions they stole? I don't think anyone ever heard that that was recovered. Gordon Chicken Man Williams, whose house the crime occurred at, was suspect number one. He was brought in by the police, and the streets were on him bad. Of course, it happened at his house. But streets did their own investigation, and even though Gordon Williams' name showed up in the newspaper articles as if being a homicide victim, and everyone thought he was DEAD, when a documentary filmmaker started to research this to do a documentary in the early 2000s, which culminated in this Netflix series, he actually found Gordon Williams, who was alive and well in Atlanta, working as a pastor. All's well that ends well, except for those robbers that met their fate and went to the big dice game in the sky, the big fight. Al Prophet, American Dope.